In the year 2147, humanity had spread across the stars, colonizing planets and moons, but one place remained shrouded in mystery: the Deathworlds. These were planets so hostile, so unforgiving, that even the most advanced technology couldn't tame them. They were places of extreme temperatures, lethal atmospheres, and predators that defied imagination. Yet, they were also places of wonder, where life had evolved in ways that seemed almost magical. And it was on one of these Deathworlds, a planet known as X-427, that the impossible happened. Dr. Cale Arvid, a xenobiologist with a haunted past, had dedicated his life to studying Deathworlds. He was a man of quiet intensity, his sharp blue eyes always scanning, always analyzing. His colleagues admired his brilliance but found him distant, almost cold. What they didn't know was that Cale carried a burden, a secret guilt that had driven him to the farthest reaches of space. Years ago, his younger sister, Lyra, had vanished during an expedition to a death world. Cale had been the mission leader, and he had blamed himself ever since. Now, Cale found himself on X-427, a planet of endless storms and jagged, black mountains. The air was thick with toxic gases, and the ground was littered with the remains of failed expeditions. But Cale wasn't afraid. He had spent years preparing for this mission, and he was determined to uncover the secrets of this deadly world. As he explored the planet's surface, Cale stumbled upon something that made his heart stop: a cryopod, half buried in the ash. It was old, its surface scarred and weathered, but it was still functioning. Inside was a man, his face frozen in a look of calm serenity. Cale's hands trembled as he activated the pod's release mechanism. The man inside opened his eyes that were startlingly familiar. "Who are you?" Cale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man blinked, disoriented. "My name is Elias," he said slowly. "Elias Arvid." Cale's breath caught in his throat. Elias Arvid was his great-grandfather, a man who had disappeared over a century ago during the first expedition to X-427. But that was impossible. Elias looked exactly as he did in the old family photos: young, strong, and untouched by time. ###2. The inciting incident: conflict begins. 1,000 words. ****. Cale brought Elias back to the research station, where the team was both fascinated and unnerved by the discovery. Elias was a living relic, a man out of time, and his presence raised questions that no one could answer. How had he survived for so long? Why hadn't he aged? And what had happened to the rest of his crew? At first, Elias was quiet, his memories fragmented and unclear. But as the days passed, he began to open up. He spoke of the expedition, of the storms that had stranded them on X-427, and of the strange, glowing creatures that had attacked their camp. He spoke of a cave, deep in the mountains, where they had sought refuge. And then, his voice faltered. "There was something in the cave," Elias said, his eyes distant. "Something ancient. It spoke to us. It offered us a choice." Cale leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What kind of choice?" Elias hesitated. "It said we could live forever, but at a cost. Some of us accepted. Others didn't." Cale's mind raced. Was it possible? Had Elias been granted immortality by some alien entity? And if so, what was the cost? He pressed Elias for more details, but the man grew agitated, his memory slipping away like sand through his fingers. Meanwhile, the rest of the team was growing uneasy. Dr. Mira Voss, the station's lead scientist, was particularly skeptical. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "If Elias has been alive for over a century, why hasn't anyone found him before now? And why hasn't he aged?" Cale didn't have answers, but he was determined to find them. He proposed an expedition to the cave Elias had mentioned, but Mira was against it. "It's too dangerous," she said. "We don't know what's out there." But Cale was adamant. He had to know the truth, not just for himself, but for Lyra. If there was a chance that she, too, had survived, he couldn't ignore it. The team reluctantly agreed, and they set out for the cave, their hearts heavy with fear and anticipation. As they approached the entrance, a sense of foreboding settled over them. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the walls of the cave seemed to pulse with a faint, green light. Cale took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cave was unlike anything Cale had ever seen. The walls were covered in strange, glowing symbols, and the air was filled with a low, humming sound that seemed to vibrate in his bones. As they ventured deeper, the light grew brighter, and the symbols became more intricate, almost hypnotic. Elias led the way, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed to know where he was going, as if the cave was calling to him. Cale followed closely, his senses on high alert. He could feel the weight of the cave pressing down on him, a sense of dread that grew with every step. Suddenly, Elias stopped. "We're here," he said, his voice barely audible. Cale looked around. They were in a large chamber, its walls lined with more of the glowing symbols. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on top of it was a strange, crystalline object. It pulsed with a soft, green light, and Cale felt a strange pull toward it, as if it was calling to him. "What is that?" Mira asked, her voice trembling. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward and placed his hand on the crystal. The moment he touched it, the room was filled with a blinding light, and Cale felt a surge of energy course through his body. When the light faded, Elias was gone. Cale stared at the empty space where Elias had been, his mind reeling. What had just happened? Where had Elias gone? And what was the crystal? Before he could process what had happened, the ground began to shake, and the walls of the cave started to close in. The team scrambled to get out, but the exit was blocked by falling debris. They were trapped. As the walls closed in, Cale noticed something strange. The symbols on the walls were changing, shifting into a pattern that seemed almost familiar. He realized with a start that they were a map of the cave, showing a hidden passageway. "This way," he shouted, leading the team down a narrow tunnel. They ran as fast as they could, the walls closing in behind them. Just when it seemed like they were about to be crushed, they burst into another chamber, this one filled with light. In the center of the room was another crystal, identical to the first. But this time, Cale noticed something different. The crystal was cracked, and the light it emitted was flickering, as if it was dying. Mira gasped. "Look," she said, pointing to the far wall. Cale turned and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was Elias, or at least, it looked like Elias. But something was wrong. His eyes were glowing with the same green light as the crystal, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. "Elias?" Cale said, his voice trembling. The figure turned to him, and Cale felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't Elias. Not anymore. The figure that had once been Elias stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Cale and the team backed away, their hearts pounding. The air was thick with tension, and the flickering light of the crystal cast eerie shadows on the walls. What are you?" Cale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "I am what remains," it said, its voice a hollow echo of Elias's. "The crystal, it sustains me. But it is dying. And when it dies, so will I." Cale's mind raced. The crystal was some kind of alien technology, a source of immortality, but at what cost? Elias had been transformed, his humanity stripped away. And now, the crystal was failing, threatening to take him with it. Mira stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. "Is there a way to save it?" she asked. "To save you?" The figure hesitated. "There is a way. But it requires a sacrifice." Cale's heart sank. He had a feeling he knew what that sacrifice would be. "What kind of sacrifice?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure turned to him, its glowing eyes piercing. "A life," it said. "A life, for a life." The room fell silent as the weight of the words settled over them. Cale felt a cold dread in the pit of his stomach. He had come here to find answers, to uncover the truth about Elias and the death world. But now, he was faced with an impossible choice. Mira shook her head. No, she said firmly. We're not sacrificing anyone. There has to be another way. The figure's expression didn't change. There is no other way, it said. The crystal is dying. Without it, I will perish. And so will the others. Kale's breath caught. Others? What others? The figure gestured to the walls, and Kale noticed for the first time that there were other figures standing in the shadows, dozens of them, their eyes glowing with the same green light. They were the missing members of Elias's crew, preserved by the crystal but trapped in this half-life. Kale felt a surge of hope. If the others were here, then maybe Lyra was too. He stepped forward, his voice filled with desperation. My sister, Lyra Arvid. Is she here? The figure hesitated, then nodded. She is here. But she is, like me. Trapped. Waiting. Kale's heart ached. He had spent years searching for Lyra, and now she was here, within reach. But to save her, he would have to make a sacrifice, a life for a life. The team was silent, the weight